So cheers to Lemon, because Lemon is the one who suggested that I put intrusive thoughts on the poll today. It's funny, when I was thinking about intrusive thoughts today, when I started to notice that that was going to be what we were going to talk about, I realized that intrusive thoughts are something that I work with. I mean, obviously I work with frequently. I think I've told all of you that one of my clinical specialties is working with anxiety, whether it's moderate anxiety, general anxiety, to, really debilitating, severe anxiety. That we would say is kind of on the spectrum of like OCD in terms of how bad it is. OCD is one of the most intense manifestations of anxiety that a person can have, and so that's it's something that I have come to specialize in within recent years. And I realized that intrusive thoughts are actually something that I work with all the time, obviously, and working with people who are experiencing intense anxiety, but it's not something that I have ever put together to talk about in a lecture type format. So when I was thinking about it today, I was kind of going off the cuff of all right, how do I want to talk about this? How do I actually think about intrusive thoughts? And so this was actually really cool for me to try and put together in a way that would hopefully be meaningful to you. But then I was like, oh, cool. So I can actually reflect on the way that I work with intrusive thoughts. I thought it was really cool how interested all of you were in this, and that there was a lot of votes for it. So with that said, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the way that I conceptualize my work with intrusive thoughts. I'm going to talk about what they are. I'm going to talk about a little bit of research about intrusive thoughts. What's interesting about research related to intrusive thoughts is you don't see a lot of research that is clinical about intrusive thoughts. So you don't see a lot of research where people are actually talking about how a therapist can work with intrusive thoughts. You mostly see in research literature people talking about how people handle intrusive thoughts. And there are actually some degree of differences, though not many, between people who are not diagnosed with OCD and people who are diagnosed with OCD. OCD standing for Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, for those who might not know what I'm referring to. If you think about the voice inside your mind, right? We all have this internal voice. Some people experience more than one voice, whether that's clinically significant or not is dependent on a diagnosis and assessment and all sorts of things. But essentially, an intrusive thought, just in general sense, is just an unwelcome thought. It's one that's involuntary, so it just kind of shows up in your head. So it's one of those thoughts that might come into your head that gives you pause for a second, where you're like, oh, that's weird that I thought that. Right? You kind of have this metacognition around it. Those are not necessarily bad. We all have them. And we would just consider those to be kind of just generic intrusive thoughts that are fleeting and whatever. Where intrusive thoughts become problematic for people is when they are what we would consider to be unwanted intrusive thoughts. So where we really run into problems is when people start to become overwhelming and distressing, or they feel really difficult to manage or eliminate. So then we start to pull those into a realm of what we would consider to be unwanted, which is where we are starting to qualify the intrusive thoughts. But when we have these thoughts that come into our mind that then all of a sudden we say to ourselves okay, well, I don't really like this thought. And then generally unwanted intrusive thoughts are very activating to us, in the sense that we generally try to do something with them cognitively. And what you do with an intrusive thought is where we start to run into issues. The way that intrusive thoughts are generally conceptualized, by me included, is that the thoughts themselves are not necessarily the problem. So if you recall last week when I was talking about anxiety, I think you're going to all find that there are a significant amount of parallels between what I'm going to say today and what I talked about last week, and that's for good reason, because this is kind of enveloped within a sphere of anxiety. So again, intrusive thoughts are not the problem. People will often come to therapy and they will say things like, I have these thoughts and I can't get them out of my mind and it's driving me crazy and they're such a problem. And my goal is to help a person shift towards not seeing intrusive thoughts as being the issue. Okay, the issue again is, what do we do with it? And so one of the ways that is really helpful to think about intrusive thoughts is wrapped up in, so I'm going to use these two as the example because they're the most common, but is being wrapped up in OCD or PTSD. Okay, so they're diagnoses that what we're going to do is basically externalize them. There's a common tactic in doing therapy called externalization, which is basically where we try to take a person's problem or some part of them and make it external to themselves so that people can see themselves as empowered to fight or manage what's going on instead of seeing it as inside them or pathologized. This could fall, you could say that this falls under like generalized anxiety disorder or something like that if you wanted to, but I'm going to use OCD and PTSD because those are the two that I most commonly work with. OCD, I don't do a ton of work with PTSD. There are a lot of therapists that are a lot more qualified and specialized in PTSD that I generally would make a referral to if PTSD is part of it. What we would say, and one of the ways, this again, now I want to say up front here that this is the way that I work with it. I have had success in working with intrusive thoughts, so I feel comfortable sharing this with all of you. But this is not the de facto way to work with it. Like, I'm sure there are other therapists that work with it in their own way, and I just want to make sure that I say that up front, that this is not the only way to work with intrusive thoughts. This is just the way that's been successful for me. One of the things about this is that people tend to see unwanted intrusive thoughts as being theirs, which they are, okay? But one of the easiest ways for me to help a person understand their intrusive thoughts is to try and externalize the source, which could be the diagnosis, or it could just be, you could call it the trigger if you wanted to. And so again, what I mean by externalize would mean that I basically say that like OCD is sending the thoughts. Okay, so OCD is sending these intrusive thoughts, or PTSD is sending these intrusive thoughts, or the trigger is sending these intrusive thoughts, as a way for a person to be able to see it as something that is, for the lack of a better phrase, done to them by the diagnosis itself. So the reason that we do that is so that I can kind of depersonalize the unwanted intrusive thoughts. So again, so that a person can see themselves as having power to manage them or power to handle them. Okay. So one of the things about OCD in particular is that generally the function of intrusive thoughts that makes it so overwhelming is the sense that the unwanted intrusive thoughts call for immediate action. And that is generally what a person is going to experience as distressing. You like how I'm half handwriting and half typing this stuff? I can't make up my mind. Immediate action is generally what is going to be considered to be distressing for the person. So, for example, my room is dirty. I have to clean it immediately. My hands are dirty. I have to wash my hands immediately. What would be another example? So somebody spilled milk. I have to clean that immediately, and it becomes this really like nagging, horrible thing. So, okay, did I leave the oven on? Right? You say you weren't even using the oven during the day, and you pull the car out of the garage and you go to drive away. The idea is that if you think about the oven potentially being on, the idea is I have to go back and check it immediately. Okay, so that's the other thing, is intensity. Also, it's actually a common misconception that a person with OCD would be, say, for example, distressed by the fact that I'm typing and writing at the same time. You know, where a person who has OCD may be like related to the mixture of types and writing, like would literally experience intrusive thoughts that are just unbelievably distressing to them as they look at this. Like, where to the point that they would feel like a need to manage it, or this immediacy of whether I need to close the browser or I need to go strangle Dr. Mick and tell him exactly what he needs to do. Like, OCD gets thrown around a lot, and OCD is really debilitating anxiety. Like, it can really, truly immobilize people. Okay, so again, when it calls for immediate action, when there's intensity, and when there is distress. Okay, so again, what we're saying when I'm working with people around this is I'm saying something along the lines of, it seems like your OCD is trying to do something to you. Now, again, is it possible to get a definition for distress tolerance? I'm pretty sure it's straightforward, but I'd like to narrow that down for myself. Yeah, so it's a person's ability to handle a situation that they don't necessarily perceive as able to control. Or it's basically like when you're feeling a sense of like really strong anxiety or dissonance or discomfort, to what extent are you able to hang in there with it? People with really low distress tolerance in the face of like anxiety or feeling like crap will often engage in avoidance-seeking behaviors a lot quicker, whereas people who have high distress tolerance will often hang in there and sort of be able to like self-soothe and self-manage and kind of hang in there through it. So you might think of it, the metaphor that I use for distress tolerance sometimes, Johnny, is like if you're getting a tattoo, some people are able to sit for tattoo appointments for hours on end, and they have a high pain tolerance, whereas some people have to take breaks every like 15-30 minutes because they have a low pain tolerance. Distress tolerance is essentially like mental pain tolerance. There are a few ways that people handle intrusive thoughts. Okay, there are actually 3 common ways. There's actually been research done on this, so this is coming not just from my experience, this is coming from research on intrusive thoughts. So we have suppression, we have focused distraction, acceptance. Suppression is basically when a person experiences unwanted intrusive thoughts, the act of suppression is basically trying to not think about the intrusive thought. So let's say as I was sitting here with all of you, I had an intrusive thought that told me that I should bash this can against my head, like that I should try and crush this can against my head. Okay? So sometimes the way that people will operate around that intrusive thought is they will say to themselves, I need to suppress that thought. So what that would mean is I wouldn't be trying to think of other things. I'd basically just be trying to not think of it. And so you can imagine, as I'm talking about that, if you think to yourself like, well, that seems kind of ridiculous, what you would do is every time you notice that thought, that intrusive thought, you basically would try to just like walk away from it in your mind. The next type of way that a person can try to handle their intrusive thoughts is through what we would call focused distraction. Focused distraction is which this one is probably going to ring a bell for a lot of people. Yeah, there we go, Hoffman. So focused distraction is basically trying to figure out something to replace the thought with. So, excuse me. So, do I focus on my breath, as Hoffman said? Do I focus on other thoughts? So maybe I have date night is coming up on Friday night. You know, a person might say, okay, so instead of thinking about this intrusive thought, I'm going to think about date night. and I'm going to think about this past weekend, or I'm going to think about my happy place, or I'm going to think about rubbing my hands together, or I'm going to think about, I don't know, the video game that I'm playing, or whatever it might be. But again, it's a form of distraction. And so the task is, anytime you notice the unwanted intrusive thought, I'm going to focus on this other thing instead. And then we have acceptance, which is where you basically notice the thought and watch it. And so what that means is that you're essentially accepting that it's there. So focused distraction would be, I feel this need to pick up this can and bash it against my head, but instead I'm going to think about counting like how many holes there are in the mesh of my pop filter on my microphone. Or I'm going to focus on my breathing. Acceptance would be, okay, I have this thought in my head right now that I don't like about wanting to bash this can against my head, and I'm just going to sit and I'm going to watch that thought, and I'm going to wonder what it is. So I'm going to visualize the thought. I'm going to try and figure out, like, you know, where is the thought coming from in my head? So, you know, is this thought coming from the back of my head and up to my eyes? Is this coming, is this like marching soldiers that are going into my ears, and or are they bees that are buzzing in my head? Like, it's a way to just try and like say, like, okay, like, what is the thought and why is it here and what does it want from me? That's where we get into where people cause problems. Okay, like what the problem is. Suppression, the negative version of suppression, or the bad, problematic version of suppression, is numbing. So sometimes people will suppress to the point that they then become numb to their experience and numb to the thoughts themselves, okay, and thereby unable to like really even notice them anymore because they've just kind of numbed themselves. So you'll see people be kind of like catatonic, or they're not particularly like excitable. The not good version of focused distraction is avoidance seeking. Focused distraction becomes problematic when a person engages in avoidance seeking behaviors. And we've talked about avoidance seeking behaviors in the context of anxiety a lot, because avoidance seeking behaviors end up crystallizing or maintaining anxiety over time. So same thing with intrusive thoughts. So if I engage in avoidance-seeking behaviors, it doesn't actually do anything to help my distress tolerance. It's actually going to make it worse in the long run. And then acceptance, as I'm sure you could probably guess, the not-so-great part of this, or the not-so-great version of acceptance, is denial. So denial of the thoughts. The difference between denial and suppression, because I'm sure people are going to ask me this, is that denial is basically trying to just suggest that the thoughts aren't there, whereas suppression is an acknowledgement of that they're there, but an attempt to kind of like an attempt to stay distance from. But it's an acknowledgement that it's there. Denial is sort of a lack of acknowledgement that they're even there. And that's where you can get really into some nasty mental gymnastics, because you have these thoughts, but then this might be where dissociation comes in, Lemon, is you have these nasty thoughts, but then you sort of deny that they're in your head, and then you kind of dissociate from yourself as a result. It can also be part of the trauma response. What am I doing as a therapist to try and work through this? I am basically trying to help people engage in healthy levels of these three things, okay? Which means that when a person is experiencing the intrusive thought, what we're working on is their distress tolerance. And so in OCD, for example, the OCD behavior of turning the doorknob to check that it's locked 3 times is actually an avoidance-seeking behavior. And it's an avoidance of the distress that the person is feeling, wondering if the door is locked, despite that they might have factual evidence to the fact that they just watched themselves lock the door. So it's basically experiencing an intrusive thought and then experiencing the anxiety and then trying to mitigate the anxiety by turning the doorknob rather than engaging a person's brain in some level of acceptance, as an example. I'm going to draw this nifty little green line here. So I want to move a person towards increased distress tolerance, okay? And what I also want to do is to help a person see There's usually a sense in this immediate action. You'll hear people say this, or at least I say you, as if all of you hear this every day like I do, that this often comes out as I have to. So I have to attend to this thought. I have to turn the doorknob. I have to wash my hands. I have to clean my apartment. You hear a lot of have to. So I'm trying to boost a person's distress tolerance. And what I'm trying to move a person to is, instead of have to, we're going to move to a space of want to. Now, this is really difficult, and this is very nuanced, and it's something I may not even really be able to capture in the context of this stream and talking about it. All right, Matt, have a good night. Is when a person, for example, comes into their apartment and they feel this need to just completely bomb it and clean it. And they feel a sense of this intrusive thought of I have to, or I have to check this doorknob. What I'm trying to help guide a person towards is, again, experiencing the level of intensity of that, experiencing the intrusive thought, and then being able to meet that intrusive thought with some level of agency, which is to say, am I going to check that door because I feel like I have to, or am I going to check that door because it's something that I want to do? Okay, and that requires exactly, Karu, exactly. It's a more empowered way to look at it. So I just locked the door. Do I want to go check it again? No. Right? Which also to some extent engages a person's rationality, which again, intrusive thoughts are generally highly emotional experiences, even though we're talking about thoughts. Okay, which is to say, no, I don't want to check the door again. And most people who have OCD will say things like, I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to wash my hands 15 times until they're raw and until it hurts to wash my hands. Like, I don't want to be doing that. So it's the idea of, okay, well, so you feel a need to wash your hands, right? There's an obsessive, unwanted, intrusive thought that says that my hands are absolutely disgusting and I have to get all the germs off. And then I would look at that person and say, well, do you feel like you have to wash your hands? And they'd say, yes. And I'd say, well, then we're not washing your hands yet. And we're building up their distress tolerance. So that's really painful for a person that wants to wash their hands, to sit there and to just be like, oh my God, like, I need to wash my hands. Like, just please let me wash my hands. Please let me wash my hands. Just please let me wash my hands. And what I'm doing is working with that person in the moment to be like, okay, like, walk me through what's going on. It seems like this is really distressing. We know that washing your hands is actually going to make this worse, that, you just washed your hands an hour ago, et cetera, et cetera. And we're waiting until the person decides whether they want to wash their hands or not. And if they're speaking out of from, if a person says, I want to, but it's out of a space of there was a voice that said they have to do it, and if you just say that you want to do it, it'll get you out of it, then we're right back to, nope, not yet, building the distress tolerance. And for some people, that process is utterly excruciating, okay, which is why I really want to make sure that I continue to repeat that, like, OCD is no joke. This is not, I look at the floor of my apartment and I go, ugh, like, it just, like, I hate it, it's gross, I'm so obsessive compulsive about it, like, maybe I'll vacuum it in 4 days. Obsessive compulsive disorder is literally like vacuuming the entire floor, putting the vacuum away, looking at the floor and saying, I need to vacuum the floor again, and pulling the vacuum out and vacuuming it again, and then before you know it, you spent your entire day vacuuming the apartment. That's OCD. A lot of this, it connects to the work that I do with anxiety, like what I talked about last week. Okay, so trying to figure out what a person's kind of solution is. Generally, a person with intrusive thoughts is going to say, those intrusive thoughts are probably always going to be there. It's just, but maybe not. They might go away over time once they realize that you're not going to attend to them, or that you're not going to let them control things. But we're going to figure out how to move to a place where unwanted intrusive thoughts are met with less intensity, or met in a way that, like, where you can handle them in a way that you want to handle them. And most people who have OCD are very adept at being able to tell me what they would like to do otherwise. And so it's just figuring out, again, what's keeping that from being able to happen. And it's kind of, this is my way of trying to conceptualize that.